I just really appreciate our worship team. I mean, besides, Ramona's skill in being able to coordinate with people, I don't think you guys, just generally, unless you've been part of a worship team before, realize the kind of effort they go through to prepare, to be able to help lead us in this experience, to be able to, they think very strategically how to help us enter in to worship. So if you could just do me a favor, can we just thank them? Can we just... All right, so this was our worship service, right? We called this our worship service. It's the service where we worship, clearly. We have this worship team, this team that helps us worship. And for those who are not really familiar with church just generally, when you think of worship, it's really easy to think just of our singing. Maybe you've broadened your mind a little bit to think in terms of praying or our quiet time. Quakers have always stood, and early friends stood for the fact that actually everything we do needs to be done in worship. Even the most mundane, the old term for our business meeting is really worship for the purpose of business. That is the idea that we are to do everything in worship. And so we have started this series where we're looking at different practices and beliefs and values that really correspond to living a life of faith. We're calling it the Examined Life, questions to explore active faith and to look at questions and ask ourselves, how are we doing in terms of spiritual growth, in terms of our relationship with God and our work in His kingdom? And so it's certainly one of the things we got to talk about is we need to talk about this idea of worship and what worship is and how we go about doing it. So let me start this morning by reading our verses here in Psalm 95. Now, the thing about the book of Psalms is really the book of Psalms is one entire book of worship. Sometimes it seems to be a little bit more personal, one person interacting with God. Others, ones like some of the first few, seem to be the community worshiping together and different things that they would do. But here's one, in Psalm 95, "Come, let us sing for joy to the Lord. Let us shout aloud to the rock of our salvation. Let us come before Him with thanksgiving and extol Him with music and song. For the Lord is the great God, the great King above all gods. In His hands are the depths of the earth, and the mountain peaks belong to Him. The sea is His, for He made it, and His hands formed the dry land. Come, let us bow down and worship. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker, for He is our God, and we are the people of His pasture, the flock under His care." The idea that worship is, there's many different things that this passage talks about in a lot of different ways it talks about worship. And even then, it's not very exhaustive. I mean, it's not telling you all the different things worship can be. So let's start with just that word worship. Worship actually, when we talk about worship, and this is the first blank in your outline, is the first part of that word comes from worthy. Worship means worthiness. We understand the idea of worthy, and then, of course, the other word is ship, which means to sail. No. That ship comes from the same word that, it's a suffix like friendship. It means the state or the nature of being friends. Or if you talk about fellowship, being in the state or nature of being fellows with one another. So this idea of ship means it is the nature of being worthy. It is crying out the worthiness of God. Anything that we do that really points out that He is God and we are not. That extols Him as somehow certainly above us, as more worthy of the supreme worthiness. He is the Alpha, He is the Prime, He is above everything. So worship is any time we engage in something that really allows our inward reality to parallel that. Somehow we, on the inward part, experience that reality. Now, the truth is we don't have to worship God. But by its very definition, we're worshiping something. Right? I mean, it's a tautology. It's a self proving fact. It's just by definition, there is something that's number one in our lives. There is something that we put as in the throne seat of our lives, so to speak. Something that we see as prime. Now, it may not be the same thing all the time. This may be our most important value one day, and another stage of our life, it may be another important value. But every single one of us have some value. However, even if we claim that that value is God, and therefore we engage in certain activities that we call worship, it doesn't necessarily mean it's inward, right? The truth is we can, and we know people who experience just the external reality of worship. They just do the external stuff. I know some people who, and you probably can think of people as well who want to be involved in church, long to be Christian, because they really like being right. They love that they can feel superior in how true Christianity is, and that they can lord that over other people, and they feel really good about that. And what's important to them is this idea of truth and being right, and they can go through the motions, but they seem to lack this inward reality of the primacy of God. There are those as well who are so emotionally needy that any kind of emotional response will do for them, and they want to be part of a church, and they want to go and do things just so they can get some of those emotional needs met without ever asking the deeper questions of whether or not it's even true. And perform in these external realities. Yet worship and the worthiness and the primacy of God is an internal reality. It is a reality of what is within us. And as I said, we all worship something. And it has an effect. Matter of fact, that's the next blank in your outline. Ignore that one. Worship affects how we see the world. Worship affects how we see the world. Let me see if I can unwrap this a little bit. Let me talk about it in the case of failure. As you think about your life, and as you think about if you look back and say, man, I really failed. I failed at life because I failed at this. Whatever this is what you worship. If I don't really reach that level of success in my job and my career, I didn't get that promotion, I have failed as a person, suggests that you worship your career and your job. If you think, man, if my kids don't end up being this, that, or the other, then you're worshiping you as a parent or your children. If you think that you somehow failed at life because you failed this. Whatever it is that you think you failed ends up as one demonstration of what it is that is of prime importance to you, what you're worshiping. And let me show you how that can affect by going back to the idea of worshiping God. There are those, that used to really bother me when people would say these kind of things because I didn't really know how to answer. And I say that as I'm almost quoting someone else I listened to this week in preparation for this sermon, as he shared this very idea that sometimes people will come to him as a pastor and say, Pastor, I blew it. I did something really awful, and I know God forgives me, and frankly, even the people who I hurt have forgiven me, but I just can't forgive myself. And I would hear people say that and begin to wonder, it's like, well, I'm not really entirely sure how to respond, because that feels like an emotional state, but maybe what's going on is a failure of worship, a failure of adoration, a failure of praise. Let me give you an example. This particular man who had been unfaithful to his wife. And he was devastated, and his wife forgave him, and his family forgave him. He actually, and talking about it, says, again, Pastor, I know God forgives me, and I know my wife has forgiven me, but I just can't forgive myself. Well, in unpacking with this person, he begins to talk about how in his upbringing, his parents, he came from a very strict, religiously conservative background that argues that sexual sin is the biggest sins you can commit. Now, I want to tell you, the Bible doesn't say that. I mean, certainly sexual sin is sin, but so is unfairly paying your workers, so is gossip, so is there are lots of things that separate us from God. But he was taught that this was somehow of prime importance, that he can't fail in this area, and because he did fail in that area, he felt like he had failed his parents, and who were dead now, and he couldn't forgive himself. And I suggest that what this man really needed was to demote his parents. That he had worshiped what his parents thought of him more than what God had thought of him. The reason he couldn't forgive himself, even though God had forgiven him, and those he had hurt had forgiven him, the reason he couldn't forgive himself is because of a failure of really having God at the prime spot, because look at how that would be different. If God were really in the prime spot, he could still feel horrible, he could still feel awful, he still has lots of consequences he needs to deal with, but he could forgive himself because he knew that the most important God, and the one that God says is important, is those he hurt, that those had forgiven him, that would be enough. But if instead he's worshiping his parents and his idolization of who he wants to be in front of his parents, that he can't feel forgiveness. What we worship has an effect on how we view our world, how we view ourselves. Does that make a little bit of sense? So then how do we know? How do we know we are worshiping God, that he is actually in the prime place of our life? I mean, I could just make the point that, well, if God is all you think about, then he's in the prime place of your life, but none of us qualify for that. Here's one test. What we do in isolation. What we do when we are alone and there are no expectations put upon us. What is it that captivates us in those moments? When we can look out the window and wistfully daydream, what do we dream of? Do we dream of finally having a house on the coast? Do we dream of being famous? Do we dream of having unending sex appeal? Whatever it is we dream of may indicate what it is that has first place in our lives. I want to point out this verse in Matthew. This is Jesus speaking, and he's talking about prayer and how we go about praying as one act of worship. And it says, when you pray, go into your room, close the door, pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Now we get this in this verse. I remember having, it just became Christianese when I was growing up, about your prayer closet, being that one place where you go and quietly and alone spend time with God. But I think what Jesus is really getting at here, as opposed to coming up with nice nifty language about being in a prayer closet, which I don't even know what that is, but has more to do with, because he's talking about there are those who will pray in front of everybody and make it real external so that everybody knows they pray and that they're really spiritual and they have it all together and that's important to them. He says that's not an indication of a quality, deep spiritual life. It's not that it's wrong to pray in front of other people. But what's vitally important is, what would you do when you're alone? That is a measure. That is a test of your spiritual life. It is a test of our worship. Now, one of the biggest dangers of being a pastor, of being a preacher, is that I often fear any time I preach that lightning is going to strike me down. Because I feel like in many ways as I teach the truths that I see in Scripture, yet I don't always live up to them, and sometimes I don't live up to them at all. Like, what does that do? What does that mean? Like God's going to, So just back away. Because the truth is, what happens in my time, and I am isolated, and I am alone, and there's nothing expected of me, my thoughts aren't always of God. And what do you do when in those moments, and you realize that this isn't what's taken primacy in your life all the time, or even maybe sometimes most of the time? Is there a way? Now, in talking in this series, we're going to be talking about beliefs, and we're going to be talking about values, and we're just going to be asking questions about our inner life. But at least with practice, you feel like if there are certain things, and worship is certainly a practice that we do, is there a way to get better at it? And I want to suggest a couple of things. If when asked the question that we're going to ask about our worship of God, and you don't really like the answer that you have very much, are there some things you can do? And I've got a couple of suggestions. This is by no means the end of them, and it is a lifelong journey, but I want to offer a couple of things. That was the first I'm going to base on this passage here in Romans 12. Now, I like the way the Message writes this. So here's what I want you to do, God helping you. I want you to take your everyday, ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going to work, and walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. I'm going to repeat that. I want you to take your everyday, ordinary life and place it before God as an offering. Remember, the image here is the offerings that the ancient Jews would offer before God. I mean, literally taking something they have and putting it on the altar. And he says, what I want you to do is I want you to take your life and I want you to place it on this altar. Your everyday life, your sleeping, eating, going to work, walking around kind of life. Embracing what God does for you is the best thing you can do for Him. The NIV says this is your spiritual act of worship. Don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit into it without even thinking. Instead, fix your attention on God. See, our culture is that part of our life that we don't really think about, that we just call normal. And we go about doing normal life and normal things, and we think the normal stuff that everybody thinks, that we just assume is normal is. And what Scripture's saying here is we take that life and turn our attention to God even in those moments. That we walk with God, that we eat with God, that we go to work with God, that all these things fit into this other realm of just being about our life. The key difference is our attention is on God. So what I'm suggesting as a way to do this is that we begin to notice God at work, that we take some intentional time in the midst of whatever we're doing. We're here sitting in service, and we've done this before, but maybe just now we begin to wonder, is God at work here? What do I see of Him in my life and elsewhere? When I'm going to work, when I'm putting the kids to bed, when I'm feeding the dog, I don't know. That we just take that. And maybe for those of you who do to-do lists, maybe you would start in the morning with your to-do list, and the first thing on your to-do list is to look at the rest of your to-do list and pray over it. To say, God, these are the things I figure I've got to do today. These are the things that are on my... But I want this to represent your priorities. I want my life to represent focusing on you. And if you choose, God, to interrupt any of these things because you've got something more important, I'm going to be okay with that. I'm going to allow you to mess with my day. Yeah, good luck. One suggestion. Next one. Yeah. So that was the first. As we walk, I don't know what else to say. It's as we talk, as we eat, as we go about our lives. The second one is based on this verse. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body you were called to peace. What it's talking about is the church. As members of one body, one congregation, one gathering, you are called to peace. And be thankful, let the message of Christ dwell among you richly, as you teach and admonish one another, with all wisdom through psalms and hymns and songs from the Spirit, singing to God with gratitude in your hearts. And whatever you do, whether in word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through Him. The thing I like about this series of verses is it is talking about that it's not just put in the individual as you go about your day, but as we go about our lives together, as we come together, as we admonish one another, as we have the message of Christ dwell among us. What I want to make the point is, as we gather, this time this morning, I think, is absolutely vital. I mean, we've heard the phrases, just simply being in a church doesn't make you any Christian more than being in a garage makes you a car. Like, we get that. We get that. But the reason we do this together, the reason we have worship together, is that there is something about what we can do for each other just by being present, just by gathering and doing this together, that has an impact on our ability to see God at work in ways we might other have blind spots. And so I think what we need to do is prioritize our time together. To say it's important enough to be there and to do it. The problem is, often we get in a tendency to look at church, to look at our worship service, and ask the question, did it do it for me? What did I get out of it? Am I able to say, this is how it was relevant to my life, this is what I got out of it? Am I feeling inspired? Now, frankly, that is one of our goals. We would love that each and every one of us would feel inspired by God to leave here different people than you were when you came in. But if that is the only test, if that is the only motivation, then we're missing something deep. Because the passage in Colossians suggests that we should also measure our worship service by what we give, by what we have done for others. Have we helped somebody else to worship? Have we been a part of being able to speak into their life, to sing into their life, to pray into their life? So we're stuck with this. Each of these sessions that we're going to be talking about over the next number of weeks, I want to give us a simple question. A question that we, before God, just ask of ourselves. That we say, God, how's this going? And so for the question for us to sit with is, do I worship God for who He is and what He's done for me? Do I worship God for what He is and what He's done for me? So we're going to move into open worship, and I encourage you to sit with that question. Feel free, if God has placed something on your heart, to go ahead and answer that question, to speak that out. On the other hand, if God has put something else on your heart and there's some other way that you feel like you can get up and decry the worthiness of God, it counts. It's open worship. I'll close this in a couple of minutes.